An elephant was in the Oval in 1971. It was just another test match to the locals in England. Many had chosen to ignore it as the visiting team was not Australia. But it was the deciding test of a series that had been kept at 0-all coming into it. And in honor of Lord Ganesh, the crowd was entertained, if entertained is the right word, by an elephant walking around the Oval. That was not the most remarkable thing about that test match. Instead, it was what actually happened during play. This was all back in a time when beating England meant absolutely everything to Indian cricket. In fact, there was a time in almost every cricket culture when that was the case. But for India specifically, to beat England was a strike back against your colonizers and oppressors. And these were things that you had in your living memory. And to beat England at their game on their soil was one of the most important things ever. And so in that one test, the Indian players said something about their identity, their place in the world, as they marched forward by completely beating England with their three spinners and a team of gutsy batters. Why am I telling you all this? Because there is a point in almost every international team's history where they have to beat England. To some sides, it really matters a lot, and to others, it's just showing that they're on the way. And that first big time of defeating England says something about your nation, how long it took you to get there, how it was done, and how it stayed with fans afterwards. So on my podcast series, Double Century, I have a new season, and the entire thing is dedicated to the first time a team beats England. From Australia's win in the late 1800s all the way through to Scotland's of recent times, we talk about the different relationships each team has to England and how their own history plays a part, and also just what happened in those matches. There are stories about Bangladesh freedom fighters and New Zealand planning for draws and celebrating a win by drunkenly singing happy birthday to an English captain as he tried to sleep in his hotel room. The history of cricket is so vast and confusing and sometimes joyful that it's a real treat to be able to go back through it and tell all these great stories. And remember, while you might be obsessed with ABDV and Kane, back in the day, the same kind of cricket fans were obsessed with Aubrey Faulkner and Bert Sutcliffe. These people helped build cricket, and I love to have the opportunity to go back and help showcase them. At times in my work, I'm accused of patronising the smaller nations. Fans from the outside will say, it's just another cricket team, it's not that big a deal. But it's not true. Every team has its own journey and things to overcome. In some cases, becoming a nation. In other cases, finding their own players, working at test crickets. And you can see, even in the episode of how Australia beat England that first time, just how much the England players and press treated the Australian players a bit like how major teams now treat associate countries. Every team has had to fight for theirs, and many continue that fight. And a big stepping stone from being a team that no one respects to being a proper international team is that first big win over England. And the other interesting thing is that they're not all memorable just because they're England. Bangladesh's history with England is so complicated through their relationship with India and Pakistan. Whereas England was destroyed by Australia's Fred Spothus, who had been bowling underarm until he saw the England players on their early tours try this fancy new style. He learnt it and then went about destroying England with their own invention. And that's really where we start the first episode, with Australia, whose story is obviously the oldest, and in many ways, if they hadn't have become this good this quick, they wouldn't have shaped international cricket the way they have. The Australians came down like a wolf on the fold. The Marleybone cracks for a trifle were bold. Our grace before dinner was very soon done, and grace after dinner did not get a run. Punch, May 1878. There was no selection committee or even a nation to represent yet. And yet the reason these guys were making the tour to England was not for the good of the game. It was because these middle-class professionals saw a way of making some money from cricket. They spent £50 each to form a collective and made their way to England to represent Australia on a tour. One of the players they'd go up against was Alan Steele. When he introduced the squad, he introduced Fred Spofford as the Demon N-word bowler. This was 1878, and because the previous team had been Indigenous, the locals expected the same. A bit like that previous tour, no one in the UK thought this was a real team worth worrying about. Even before this, the English players had thought of them as a bit of a joke. Australia had already beaten England in what we now recognise as the first test, but that was on the other side of the world, and no one thought that was a strong team. It was, after all, graceless. Grace said of the Australian tourists, "We never for a moment thought of classing them with an English team." Charles Alcock, Secretary of Surrey, remarked, "The idea of a visit from an Australian team was at first treated as something of a joke by the English cricketers." But the MCC would host the Australians in 1878 at Lord's. 4,742 people turned up to see the game. The MCC had Monkey Hornby, George Hearn, Alfred Shaw, Greg Morley, and Grace. They weren't just there to win, they actively wanted to humiliate these Australians. This was supposed to be a 3-day match. You can find this series in all the normal places you find podcasts. Just type in Double Century, Jarrod Kimber, and you can listen to not just this season, but the last 2 seasons as well.